The morning mist clung to Cemetery Ridge like the ghosts of 50,000 men who had fallen there just 3 years prior. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain stood at the edge of the battlefield, his weathered hands gripping a letter from his wife that spoke of their son's nightmares that mirrored his own. The year was 1866, and America was attempting to heal from wounds that ran deeper than any surgeon's blade could reach. Chamberlain had survived the hell of Gettysburg, leading the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment in their desperate defense of Little Round Top on July 2, 1863. The memory of that day haunted him still. The screaming Confederate charges, the smell of gunpowder thick as fog, and the weight of command that had pressed upon his shoulders like a millstone. He had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, but the recognition felt hollow when weighed against the faces of the men who would never return home. Across the field, another figure moved through the tall grass. Sergeant William Scott of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment walked with a pronounced limp, a souvenir from Pickett's charge, when a Confederate minie-ball had shattered his left leg. Scott had been among the 262 men of his regiment who had charged into the advancing Confederate forces on July 2nd, buying precious time for the Union line to reform. Only 47 of his comrades had walked away from that charge. The mathematics of survival were cruel, and Scott carried the weight of those numbers in every labored step. The two veterans had not planned to meet on this gray October morning, but fate had drawn them both back to the place where their lives had been forever altered. They recognized each other not by sight, for they had never formally met during the battle, but by the particular way that survivors of Gettysburg carried themselves. There was a gravity to their movements, a careful deliberation that spoke of men who had seen the elephant and lived to tell the tale. As documented in Harper's Weekly from October 1866, thousands of veterans were returning to the battlefields of the war, seeking something they could not name. Some came seeking closure, others came searching for meaning in the chaos they had witnessed. Most came because the memories would not leave them be, and they hoped that confronting the ground where their innocence had died might somehow resurrect their peace of mind. Chamberlain approached Scott slowly, noting the way the younger man's hand instinctively moved toward where his rifle would have hung. "You were here," Chamberlain said simply. It was not a question. Scott nodded, his eyes scanning the field where Pickett's men had made their legendary charge. "1st Minnesota. We held the line until Hancock's boys could get into position." His voice carried the flat tone of a man who had learned to speak of horror, as if it were weather. The two men stood in comfortable silence, each lost in memories that would never fully fade. Around them, the Pennsylvania countryside was rebuilding itself, farms sprouting where artillery had once thundered, but the scars remained visible to those who knew how to look. Broken fence posts marked where battle lines had formed, and the occasional rusted button or piece of metal caught the morning light like teardrops on the earth. Neither man yet understood that this chance meeting would alter the course of their post-war lives, or that their shared experience would become the foundation for a movement that would reshape how America remembered its most defining conflict. The unlikely partnership between Chamberlain and Scott began with a simple invitation. As the October sun climbed higher over the Gettysburg battlefield, Chamberlain suggested they visit the newly established Soldiers' National Cemetery, where President Abraham Lincoln had delivered his famous address 3 years prior. What started as a casual walk between veterans soon revealed itself as something far more significant. Scott's limp became more pronounced as they walked, and Chamberlain found himself unconsciously adjusting his pace. The colonel's own war wounds, a hip injury from Petersburg and the psychological weight of command, had left him with his own physical limitations, though he bore them with the stoic dignity expected of an officer. Together they made their way past the scattered headstones, each marker representing a story cut short by war's cruel arithmetic. "I've been thinking about starting something," Scott said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something. For the boys who came back, the ones who didn't die but aren't quite living either." He gestured toward the cemetery with his walking stick, a crude affair he had carved himself from Pennsylvania oak. "There's got to be more than just burying the dead and forgetting the living." Chamberlain paused at a headstone marked simply, "Unknown Soldier, First Day." The inscription was weathered but legible, a testament to one of the thousands of men whose names had been lost to history, but whose sacrifice remained carved in stone. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Scott pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, the edges worn soft from handling. It was a letter from his sister in Minnesota, describing the struggles of veterans in their community. Men who had returned home to find their jobs filled by others, their families changed by years of separation, their minds haunted by memories that civilians could never understand. The letter spoke of former soldiers drinking themselves to death, of marriages failing under the weight of unspoken trauma, of proud men reduced to begging on street corners. As reported in the New York Tribune during the autumn of 1866, the problems facing Civil War veterans were becoming increasingly apparent to communities across the nation. The federal government's pension system was overwhelmed and bureaucratic, leaving many deserving veterans without adequate support. Local charities were well-meaning, but often inadequate to address the scale of need among the returning soldiers. Thinking of a brotherhood, Scott continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. Not just another veterans organization for parades and speeches, but something real. Something that helps men find work, helps them talk about what they've seen, helps them remember they're not alone in carrying these memories. Chamberlain studied the younger man's face, noting the intensity in his eyes. Here was a soldier who had witnessed the worst of human nature, but still believed in the possibility of redemption. "You're talking about something that's never been done before," he said slowly. "The government has the Grand Army of the Republic, but that's mostly political." "Exactly," Scott replied. "This would be different. This would be about healing, not just remembering, about helping men find their way back to being human again." The two veterans spent the remainder of the morning walking through Gettysburg, past the wheat field where so many had fallen, past the peach orchard where artillery had torn the earth itself apart, past Devil's Den where sharpshooters had turned rocks into fortresses. With each step, their conversation deepened, moving from the theoretical to the practical. How would such an organization be funded? How would they reach veterans scattered across the growing nation? How could they help men who had been taught that admitting weakness was tantamount to cowardice? By the time they reached the Baltimore Pike, the rough outline of their plan had taken shape. They would call it the Brotherhood of Gettysburg, and it would be founded on principles that went beyond politics or regional loyalties. Union and Confederate veterans alike would be welcome, bound together by their shared understanding of war's true cost. The organization would focus on practical assistance, finding jobs, providing temporary shelter, offering medical care for service-related injuries, but it would also address the invisible wounds that no doctor could treat. As the afternoon, shadows lengthened across the battlefield, both men realized they had found something they had not known they were looking for, a purpose that could give meaning to their survival. The winter of 1866 brought more than snow to the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. In the back room of McConaughey's general store, a revolution was quietly taking shape. What had begun as a conversation between two veterans had grown into something far larger and more ambitious than either Chamberlain or Scott had initially envisioned. The Brotherhood of Gettysburg had attracted its first dozen members by Christmas, each man carrying his own collection of war stories and post-war struggles. There was Marcus Webb, a former Confederate sergeant from Virginia who had lost his left arm at Pickett's charge and now made his living as a one-armed carpenter. Thomas McKnight, a Union artillery captain from Pennsylvania, had returned home to find his wife remarried and his children calling another man father. David Hornsby, a Confederate sharpshooter from Alabama, had been blinded in one eye by shrapnel, but possessed an uncanny ability to understand the emotional wounds that others carried. The meetings were held every Tuesday evening after the store had closed and the streets of Gettysburg had grown quiet. McConaughey, himself a veteran of the Pennsylvania Reserves, had offered the space free of charge, understanding instinctively what these men were trying to accomplish. The room was sparse, a few wooden chairs arranged in a circle, a pot-bellied stove that never quite managed to heat the entire space, and a table where the men would spread maps and correspondence from veterans across the country. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer's coverage of veterans' affairs in early 1867, the challenges facing former soldiers were becoming a national crisis. The newspaper reported that suicide rates among veterans were climbing and that hospitals were seeing increasing numbers of men suffering from what doctors were beginning to call soldier's heart, a condition characterized by nightmares, sudden, violent episodes, and an inability to adjust to civilian life. Chamberlain had taken on the role of the Brotherhood's unofficial leader, though he insisted that all decisions be made collectively. His experience as a college professor served him well in organizing the group's activities and maintaining correspondence with potential members throughout the country. Scott, meanwhile, had become the organization's practical arm, using his background as a farmer and his natural talent for connecting with people to establish networks of support in rural communities. The Brotherhood's first major test came in February when a letter arrived from a veteran in Ohio named Patrick Sullivan. Sullivan had been present at Gettysburg as part of the Irish Brigade, fighting in the wheat field on the second day of battle. His letter was barely legible, written in a shaking hand that spoke of either injury or desperation. He wrote of being unable to hold employment, of family members who crossed the street to avoid him, of nights spent walking the streets because sleep brought only dreams of dead friends calling his name. "I heard about what you boys are doing down in Pennsylvania," Sullivan's letter concluded. "I don't know if you can help a man like me, but I'm running out of options. The bottle isn't working anymore, and I'm starting to think maybe the boys who didn't make it home were the lucky ones." The letter was passed around the circle during that Tuesday's meeting, each man reading it in silence. When it had made its way back to Chamberlain, he looked up to find every face in the room reflecting the same grim determination. "We're not equipped for this," McKnight said quietly. "We're barely keeping our own heads above water." "But who else is going to do it?" Webb countered, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as a Virginian. "The government? The churches? They mean well, but they don't understand what we've seen." Hornsby, who had been silent through most of the meeting, finally spoke. "My grandmother used to say that sometimes the only way to heal your own wounds is to help heal someone else's. Maybe that's what we're supposed to be doing here." The decision was unanimous. The Brotherhood would expand beyond Gettysburg, establishing chapters in major cities across the North and South. They would create a network of support that could reach men like Sullivan wherever they might be. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps, impossibly so, but these were men who had charged into Confederate artillery and lived to tell the tale. Impossible was a word they had learned to ignore. By spring, the Brotherhood of Gettysburg had received over 200 letters from veterans across the country, each one a testament to the hidden war being fought in the hearts and minds of the men who had survived America's greatest conflict. The spring of 1867 found the Brotherhood of Gettysburg at a crossroads. Success had brought its own challenges as the organization struggled to meet the overwhelming demand for help that poured in from every corner of the reunited nation. The small room behind McConaughey's general store had become inadequate for their growing needs, and the founding members found themselves working from dawn until well past midnight, responding to letters, organizing relief efforts, and attempting to establish chapters in distant cities. Chamberlain had taken a leave of absence from his position at Bowdoin College in Maine, dedicating himself fully to the Brotherhood's mission. His wife, Fanny, had initially expressed concern about his decision, but she had come to understand that this work was as essential to her husband's healing as any medicine. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war were becoming less frequent, replaced by a sense of purpose that had been missing since he had hung up his uniform. Scott, meanwhile, had sold his farm in Minnesota and relocated permanently to Gettysburg, using the proceeds to help fund the Brotherhood's expanding operations. He had become the organization's primary organizer, traveling throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York to establish new chapters and train local leaders. His natural charisma and obvious sincerity had made him an effective spokesman for the Brotherhood's mission, and his own visible war wounds served as a powerful reminder of the sacrifices that veterans had made. The Brotherhood's first major success came in April, when they received a letter from Patrick Sullivan in Ohio. The man who had written so desperately in February now reported that he had found steady work as a night watchman at a textile mill, a position that accommodated both his need for solitude and his tendency toward insomnia. More importantly, he had helped establish a Brotherhood chapter in Cleveland, which had already begun assisting other veterans in the area. As documented in the Atlantic Monthly's examination of post-war veterans organizations in the summer of 1867, the Brotherhood of Gettysburg had become a model for veteran assistance programs throughout the country. Unlike the Grand Army of the Republic, which focused primarily on political activities and commemoration, the Brotherhood emphasized practical assistance and emotional support for veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. The organization's nonpartisan approach had initially drawn skepticism from both North and South. Many Union veterans were suspicious of an organization that welcomed former Confederates, while Southern veterans worried about potential political motivations. However, the brothers' consistent focus on healing rather than politics gradually won over critics from both sides of the former conflict. The Brotherhood's most innovative program was their Witness Circle meetings, where veterans could speak openly about their war experiences without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. These gatherings, held in darkened rooms lit only by candles, allowed men to share stories they had never told their families, to weep for friends long dead, and to admit to fears and doubts that civilian society would never understand. Marcus Webb, the one-armed Confederate carpenter, had become particularly skilled at facilitating these sessions. His quiet dignity and obvious suffering gave him a credibility that transcended regional loyalties. Men who had spent years bottling up their trauma found themselves able to speak freely in his presence, sharing nightmares and guilt that had festered in silence since the war's end. The Brotherhood's growth was not without its challenges. Funding remained a constant concern, as the organization relied entirely on donations from members and sympathetic civilians. Some chapters struggled with personality conflicts between former enemies, while others found themselves overwhelmed by the scope of need in their communities. Several prominent members left the organization after disagreements about whether to accept government funding, fearing that such support would compromise their independence. Despite these obstacles, the Brotherhood continued to expand throughout 1867. Chapters were established in major cities from Boston to Charleston, from Chicago to New Orleans. Each chapter operated independently, but maintained correspondence with the central organization in Gettysburg, sharing successful strategies and requesting assistance with particularly difficult cases. By autumn, the Brotherhood had assisted over 1,000 veterans in finding employment, housing, or medical care. More significantly, they had created a network of understanding and support that stretched across the entire country, connecting men who had fought on opposite sides of the war, but now shared a common struggle to reclaim their lives from the shadow of trauma. The organization's success had not gone unnoticed in Washington, where politicians were beginning to recognize the scale of veterans' needs and the inadequacy of existing government programs. The autumn of 1867 brought unexpected visitors to the Brotherhood's headquarters in Gettysburg. Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, a radical Republican known for his fierce advocacy of veterans' rights, arrived unannounced on a crisp October morning, accompanied by Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Their presence immediately raised concerns among the Brotherhood's leadership, who had worked carefully to maintain their organization's nonpartisan character. Chamberlain received the senators in the front room of what had once been McConaughey's store, now serving as the Brotherhood's official headquarters. The space had been transformed over the past year, with filing cabinets containing correspondence from veterans across the nation, maps marking the locations of established chapters, and walls covered with photographs of members who had died. Since the war's end, not from battlefield wounds but from the slower violence of despair and neglect, Colonel Chamberlain, Senator Wade began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "We've been watching your organization with great interest. The work you're doing here represents exactly the kind of innovation that Congress needs to understand as we consider new legislation for veterans' care." Stevens, despite his age and failing health, spoke with the passion that had made him one of the most feared orators in Washington. The federal government's current approach to veterans' assistance is woefully inadequate. We have men who preserve the Union now begging for scraps from inadequate pension programs. Your Brotherhood has demonstrated that there are better ways to serve those who served us. The conversation that followed would prove to be one of the most significant in the Brotherhood's history. Scott, who had been summoned from his work organizing a new chapter in Harrisburg, joined the discussion, bringing with him a thick folder of correspondence that illustrated the scope of veterans' needs across the country. Webb, despite his initial discomfort at meeting with prominent Republican politicians, contributed his perspective as a former Confederate who had found acceptance and assistance through the Brotherhood's work. According to the congressional record, from the autumn session of 1867, Senator Wade had been preparing comprehensive legislation to reform the federal pension system and establish new programs for veterans' assistance. The Brotherhood's model of comprehensive support, combining practical assistance with emotional healing, had captured the attention of progressive politicians who recognized that traditional approaches were failing thousands of veterans. The senators proposed a partnership that would provide federal funding for the Brotherhood's expansion while maintaining their operational independence. The legislation would establish a network of federally funded veteran assistance centers based on the Brotherhood's model, with each center offering job placement services, medical care, and counseling support. The Brotherhood would train the staff for these centers and provide ongoing consultation on best practices. The proposal created immediate tension within the Brotherhood's leadership. Some members, particularly those from the South, viewed any association with the federal government with deep suspicion. They had witnessed the corruption and inefficiency of Reconstruction programs and feared that government involvement would compromise the Brotherhood's effectiveness and integrity. "We built this organization to help veterans, not to serve as a tool for politicians," argued David Hornsby, the former Confederate sharpshooter who had become one of the Brotherhood's most respected counselors. "The moment we take government, money, we become accountable to political interests rather than to the men we serve." Others, however, saw the partnership as an opportunity to expand their impact far beyond what private funding could achieve. McKnight, the Union artillery captain, pointed out that the Brotherhood was already struggling to meet the demand for their services. "We're turning away men who need help because we simply don't have the resources," he argued. "If government funding can help us reach more veterans, don't we have an obligation to consider it?" The debate continued for weeks, with passionate arguments on both sides. Letters poured in from chapter leaders across the country, some supporting the proposed partnership and others threatening to withdraw from the organization if it accepted federal funding. The question went to the heart of what the Brotherhood represented. Was it primarily a grassroots organization of veterans helping veterans, or was it a model for a new approach to veterans' care that should be implemented on a national scale? Chamberlain found himself in the difficult position of trying to hold the organization together while navigating these competing visions. His experience as a military commander had taught him the importance of unity of purpose, but he also recognized that the Brotherhood's strength had always come from its diversity of perspectives and approaches. The decision, when it finally came, reflected the Brotherhood's commitment to democratic principles and collective decision-making. The winter meeting of 1868 would be remembered as the moment when the Brotherhood of Gettysburg transformed from a small organization of veterans into a movement that would reshape American society's approach to caring for those who had served their country. The debate over federal partnership had raged for months, but as snow fell outside the headquarters in Gettysburg, the Brotherhood's leadership finally reached a decision that would define their legacy. The compromise they reached was as ingenious as it was controversial. The Brotherhood would accept federal funding for specific programs while maintaining complete operational independence. They would establish a separate organization, the American Veterans Relief Society, which would work directly with the government to implement the proposed assistance centers. The original Brotherhood would continue as a private organization, free to advocate for veterans' rights and provide services without political interference. Chamberlain, who had been elected as the Brotherhood's first official president, explained the decision in a letter that was distributed to all chapters. "We have learned from our war that victory sometimes requires tactical flexibility. By working with the government where we can be effective, while maintaining our independence where we must be free, we serve our brothers in arms in the fullest possible way." The partnership bore fruit quickly. By the summer of 1868, The first federally funded Veterans Assistance Centers had opened in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, with Brotherhood-trained staff providing services to hundreds of veterans. The success of these centers led to rapid expansion, and within 2 years, similar facilities were operating in every major city in the country. The Brotherhood's influence extended far beyond direct service provision. Their documentation of veterans' needs had provided Congress with the evidence necessary to pass the Veterans Assistance Act of 1869, which established the first comprehensive federal program for veterans' mental health care. The legislation, revolutionary for its time, recognized that the wounds of war were not always visible and that healing required more than just medical treatment. As reported in Harper's Magazine in the spring of 1870, the Brotherhood's approach to veterans' care had begun to influence civilian health care as well. The organization's emphasis on treating the whole person rather than just symptoms had attracted attention from medical professionals who recognized the limitations of traditional approaches to trauma and mental illness. The Brotherhood's most lasting contribution, however, was cultural rather than institutional. Through their work, they had begun to change how American society viewed veterans and their needs. The stigma that had once surrounded men who struggled with war trauma began to fade as the Brotherhood's advocacy made clear that such struggles were a natural consequence of service rather than a sign of weakness. Webb, who had become the Brotherhood's most effective spokesman, often spoke about the transformation he had witnessed. "When I first came to Gettysburg, I was a broken man who felt that his sacrifice had been forgotten. Through the Brotherhood, I learned that our wounds are not marks of shame but badges of service, and that healing comes not through forgetting, but through understanding." The organization's success had attracted veterans from other conflicts as well. Men who had served in the Mexican-American War, Indian Wars, and other frontier conflicts found in the Brotherhood a model for addressing their own struggles with military service and civilian adjustment. The organization began to expand its mission beyond Civil War veterans, recognizing that the challenges they addressed were universal among those who had served in combat. By 1870, the Brotherhood of Gettysburg had grown to include over 10,000 members in chapters across the country. Their influence could be seen in everything from federal veterans policy to local community programs. More importantly, they had created a culture of support and understanding that would endure long after the original founders had passed away. The veterans who had met by chance on a misty morning at Gettysburg had accomplished something that military victory alone could never achieve. They had transformed their shared suffering into a force for healing that would benefit generations of veterans who would follow in their footsteps. The Brotherhood had proven that the true victory of war lies not in the defeat of enemies, but in the redemption of those who survived to carry forward the lessons learned through sacrifice and struggle. In the end, the Brotherhood of Gettysburg had become more than an organization. It had become a testament to the power of human resilience and the possibility of finding meaning in even the darkest chapters of history.